These islands are haunted by the memory of those who have run up against them. Whalers buried next to the remains of their prey. Ghost ships abandoned and left to rust. These vast empty spaces seem never to have known a living presence. Yet here and there are traces of men's battle with the island, as if they had intended their daily struggle for survival to be known one day. Archaeologists have just uncovered the hut of Kerguelen's Robinson Crusoe, an Englishman called John Nunn.
When first I landed in Liverpool, I went upon the spree.
With 3 companions, he spent 5 years here in the 1820s, before a passing boat finally spotted them.
But before me money was all gone on Lake
They built themselves a hut out of peat, but they clearly had a hard time coping with the island's hostile conditions, especially the constant damp. They left this wonderful fireplace, which was in fact what led us to unearth this very moving site. They called their hut Hope Cottage, for the obvious reason that they spent their time hoping to catch sight of the vessel, which would put an end to their suffering. To keep up their morale, they made ink out of albatross bile and recorded the details of their stay on the island in the margins of the Bible they had saved from their shipwrecked boat. Some 2 yards from our little hut was the pool in question, a small soft-water lake, almost 400 yards in circumference. The sea elephants, seals and ducks often gathered there, and observing their habits proved a great source of amusement to us. By boiling them for several hours and adding salt to taste, they provided us not only with a very nourishing meal, but a tasty and pleasant stew. These sea elephants were not only good meat, but they were also a source of fuel, which kept us warm and enabled us to cook. They also were a means of having light to comfort us when the sun had disappeared beneath the horizon, and we had returned to our hut.
A century later, Dubatti's crew were to experience the solitude of John Nunn and his companions themselves. The island's coasts were still unexplored. In fact, that was one of the challenges Raymond Rallier Dubatti had set himself.
He thought it would be a good idea to make a map of the Kerguelen Islands, given that nobody had ever explored or even charted them. He had his heart set on leading an expedition and making it one which would be of use to other sailors.
Rallier Dubatti was aware of the risks he was taking. Kerguelen had defeated men better equipped than him, beginning with the one who gave his name to the island. In 1772, a French expedition set out to find the last great undiscovered continent, a vast expanse of land in the southern oceans, with a mythical place in the tales of old sea dogs. The expedition's leader, also from Brittany, was an experienced sailor. His name, Yves de Kerguelen. After many weeks at sea, he at last glimpsed what he took to be the continent coveted by his king, Louis XV. A storm prevented him from actually landing on the island, but not from filing a dazzling report on his return.
All that my eyes could discern was sprinkled with woods and greenery, which would indicate a country inhabited and cultivated with thought. In the colder latitudes, one can find diamonds, rubies, sapphires and emeralds. Perhaps one might also find their new races, living naturally, ignorant of the artifices of civilized men.
Encouraged by Kerguelen's conclusions, the king financed a more ambitious expedition to this new El Dorado. Once more, a storm made a mockery of Kerguelen's plans. But one of his ships, l'Oiseau, managed to enter a bay, guarded like a doorway by a huge stone arch, which has since collapsed. On the 6th of January 1774, man finally set foot on this beach, which had remained inviolate since the beginning of time. That man was not Kerguelen, but one of his crew members. He carried with him a bottle containing a message by which Kerguelen claimed the new continent for the King of France. He dropped the bottle somewhere in this bay, which became the recognized point of entry to the island. Rather than setting out to explore, an outbreak of scurvy forced Kerguelen toward an immediate return. He would never set foot on this island, whose outline he sketched for the king. On his return, 8 months later, Louis XV was dead. A conspiracy grew up against Kerguelen. After a controversial trial, he was imprisoned in the Château de Saumur and left to rue his one great mistake, having taken his dream for reality.
Had he been caught telling tall stories? Yes, of course he had. He had painted a rather optimistic picture of his discovery. But can you really hold that against him? If you put yourself in his shoes. At the time, discovering a new continent was absolutely extraordinary. He had barely glimpsed it through the fog and rain. Did he realize it was totally desolate? Or did he think it might have some potential, even if it was just livestock breeding? Maybe he thought it could be colonized. I don't know, but he certainly let his joy and enthusiasm get the better of him. He thought he had discovered Australia, let's not forget, and so he exaggerated somewhat. I can forgive him that.
While Kerguelen struggled to refute the accusations made against him and prove his loyalty to the king, his great English rival, James Cook, set off in the same direction. He too had spent years searching for Australia, but he had learned how to protect his crew from scurvy and was lucky to have 2 easily maneuverable boats. In turn, he sailed past the archway and into the bay. As it was Christmas Day, Cook named the bay Port Christmas and sketched it. He found the bottle left by the French, added a mention of his visit, and replaced the bottle. Then he set out to explore, with the scientists accompanying his expedition. He found a land without trees, cold and barren, battered by violent winds, with no sign of life at any distance from the coast.
The land in question is an island of no great extent, which from its sterility I should with great propriety call the island of desolation, but that I would not rob Monsieur de Kerguelen of the honour of its bearing his name.
Cook demolished forever the myth of Kerguelen as the Australian continent, but that word desolation would remain forever associated with these islands. Khalid Dubati wanted to take his place in history among the great explorers. He had named his second-hand ship after his mentor Charcot, whom he had served as cabin boy on a trip to the Antarctic ice cap, and whose advice he sought at all times. That experience of polar conditions and the famous explorer's patronage ensured Durati's standing in the eyes of his tiny crew, made up of his brother Henri and 4 sailors, 3 of whom were under 20.
Even to such an inexperienced crew, my father, who was only 25 at the time, must have seemed very young. They were showing amazing faith in him, definitely.
Certainement.
On the night of the 9th of March 1908, the crew of the JB Sharko at last glimpsed land. Sailing into the bay, they were entranced by the sight that greeted them.
We were welcomed on arrival by our hosts on this island, which no human being inhabits. They watched us with eyes wide open in surprise. Penguins, hundreds of penguins, in closed ranks, like soldiers ready to defend their coast against invasion.
But the invasion had already taken place, and it was the man who destroyed the myth of a new El Dorado who was responsible for it. For James Cook had noted at least one natural resource on the shores of this barren land: mammals whose blubber was very rich in oil. At the time, the great European cities had just discovered whale oil as a means of lighting their parlours. That was the island's real bounty. Hunters flocked to the new whaling ground, in tiny sloops at first, then in bigger vessels with launches, mostly American and British. One whale represents 7,000 litres of oil. Onshore, there were abundant sea elephants for oil and sea lions for fur. In 100 years, 1.5 million sea elephants were killed, and the sea lion disappeared from these waters. Under constant pressure to cut costs, the hunters spent years on end in regions of which they made no maps, so as not to reveal their hunting grounds. The fog often deprived them of any means of fixing their position anyway. On each trip, they put their lives at risk almost every day.
My great-grandfather was shipwrecked off East Island in 1866. He spent 6 months with the teams of sea elephant and seal hunters who lived on the island, before he was picked up by the Esther, one of those boats which visited each island regularly to load up the hunter's catch.
Qui visitait régulièrement les îles pour ramasser, pour charger la récolte des chasseurs. Tout ça, il a raconté très précisément.
He tells the story in great detail in his log.
Ce naufrage, c'était violent.
The shipwreck had been very violent. In a couple of hours, a raging storm had blown up, as happens very often down there, taking them completely by surprise. They were caught on the hop, and that was that. The boat was immediately blown out of control and onto the rocks, where it ran aground. The first thing they did was to build a shelter. That was the obvious priority. They also tried to recover as much as they could from the wreckage of their boat. That must have taken them some time. My great-grandfather then sketched their camp. You mustn't forget that these hunters spent the whole year on the island, sometimes 2 or even 3 before they were relieved. His sketches show them inside their huts, lying on their bunks, reading or drawing. They also made toys and all kinds of objects that they would be able to sell when they got home, to supplement their pay and their earnings from whale oil.
Ces gens-là travaillaient
Those men were used to working in isolated places.
complètement perdus. Et on ne pensait pas
Very
souvent
few people
qu'eux,
ever thought
il
about
fallait
them.
être assez rudimentaire aussi
You had to
pour
be fairly
survivre.
ruddy to stick it out.
Et,
They were
pour
hardy
rester
men,
sur place. C'était les
ready for
gaillards,
anything,
prêts à tout,
for any
à
hardship.
subir, à tout encaisser en fin de compte. Il y a un travail à faire.
When it comes down to it, there was a job to be done somewhere off the beaten track, and they went because it was well paid. That's all there is to it.
Would you have liked that?
Je pense, oui.
I think so, yes.
Je pense que ces hommes-là
They were
ont
living in
vécu une
extraordinary
époque
times.
absolument extraordinaire.
Certainly my great-grandfather
Surtout
was.
mon arrière-grand-père.
James Stubbington eventually left Crozet Island on a vessel sent each year to pick up the survivors of shipwrecks. Knowing the reputation of the islands, his family had given up hope of ever seeing him again.
Ça a dû traumatiser mon
It must have been very
arrière-grand-mère,
hard for my great-grandmother, of
Elle
course.
croyait qu'il était perdu,
She thought he was lost,
terminé.
dead.
Les hommes de la
Ever
famille,
since, the men in my family have been
ont été,
strongly
si vous
advised
voulez,
against going to sea.
fortement déconseillés de partir en mer. Il y en a plusieurs oncles qui voulaient
Several of my uncles wanted to join the merchant navy and were stopped from doing so because of the memory of what had happened to my great-grandfather.
Mauvais souvenir de ces années, si vous voulez, de mon arrière-grand-père. C'était
It
pas la
wasn't
seule
the only
fois
time he was reported
qu'il
missing.
portait disparu.
Many castaways were less fortunate than Stubbington and lost their lives on the shores of Crozet, Kerguelen, Amsterdam and St. Paul. Like the French crew of the Tamaris, who attached messages to the feet of hundreds of albatross. One was found thousands of miles away in Australia. But by the time help arrived, the men had attempted to sail off the island on a raft. As the whalers ventured further and further into the ice to hunt, tales of these forbidding lands, battles with frightening animals, and encounters with huge albatross became legendary. Gustave Doré's illustrations and Jules Verne's books popularized adventure in the icy southern seas, with a generation of school children, nourishing the dreams of future adventurers. However, the first wave of invasions was over. By the time gaslighting became widespread in the 1890s and threatened to ruin the whalers, the French government had long forgotten its distant territories. And then, the fanciful dreams of two brothers, Henri and René Bossière, sparked a second invasion. By warning the French government that Britain intended to annex Kerguelen, they obtained a 50-year concession in 1893.
They had two motives. The first was that they were the sons of a famous builder of whaling ships. So they wanted to try to keep the family business going. And then there was their sense of patriotism, because in the family everybody was very French, extremely French. They could not allow another country to take control of the islands.
In exchange for a promise to develop Kerguelen, the two brothers were given full powers over the territory, earning the nickname the Governors of Kerguelen. They spent many years planning their project. René Bossière filled whole notebooks with drawings of every type of whale and notes on hunting them. He visited Norway, where technical innovation had revitalized the whaling industry. He inspected their factories and made copies of their design. He produced market research promising spectacular returns. Expenditure 200,000 francs, income 600,000 francs. But the Bossière brothers fell victim to the same misfortune which had defeated Yves de Kerguelen. All their attempts to develop the island failed. In 15 years, they did not even manage to land on it one single time. In 1908, Khalid Dubati did land on the island and found it deserted. "Kerguelen is ours," he exclaims. During the voyage, he had laid out his secret plan to his father.
Dearest Papa, I have just received a copy of the decree of concession to the Bussière. Surely they have forgone their rights by now. I have addressed a request to assume the concession of Kerguelen and Crozet to the colonies minister. What do I risk?
While waiting for the minister to reply, he devoted himself to his mission's original aim: exploration. He stumbled across the ruins of a house built 5 years earlier by a German scientific expedition en route for the South Pole. It was his first encounter with the island's curse. Despite impressive means, the Germans had been forced to flee, laid low by a terrible epidemic.
I was struck dumb by what I saw around me. There, years earlier, my predecessors in exploration had built a house and ensured themselves a certain amount of civilized comfort. But the place had been abandoned in very strange circumstances, as if its occupants had been disturbed in the course of their daily chores by the signal of impending attack. They had decamped, leaving all their possessions behind. I found hundreds of bottles of wine and liquor, all of them empty.
Khalid Dubati did not have the same resources as the Germans, and so, like others before him, he was reduced to hunting sea elephants to sell oil and pay his crew.
It was a terrible massacre, of the kind which would shock sensitive souls and those at home who would not harm a fly. But let me remind you, we were on Desolation Island and were like men in primitive times. The herd of sea elephants, so monstrous, so ugly, with their fat noses pointed towards us and their tails beating the rocks, roused in us the brutal force of our ancestors, which had allowed man to become master of the world.
To boil down the blubber, Khalid Dubati used cauldrons left behind by earlier whalers. He built vats and what he proudly called his little factory in Observatory Bay. It was from that vantage point that he looked on helplessly, 10 months after his arrival, as the power of the Bussière steamed in to annihilate his dream. The arriving vessel was unlike the old whalers, coal-powered, easy to maneuver, and equipped with a recent Norwegian invention, the harpoon. It rendered the hunt less risky for men and merciless for whales. Systematic massacre made their oil profitable once more. Within a few months, a full-scale industrial complex had sprung up in Port Jeanne d'Arc, beneath Khalid Dubati's very eyes. And yet this model factory, with its 3 boilers, its huge autoclaves to melt the blubber, and its workers' barracks, was not French at all. The Bussière had subcontracted to the Norwegians, the masters of world whaling. It was the only whale processing factory ever to be built on French territory, a cottage industry a world away, which today offers up its secrets.
We know that 100 people worked here for 3 months at a time. All of them were Norwegian. We also know, thanks to Khalid Dubati, that they worked with what we would call today incredible professionalism. For example, they had brought with them 2 categories of carpenters, those who worked on the ships and those who built their housing. It is thanks to their professionalism that we have, in spite of the passage of time, another testimony to an heroic age.
Malgré les dégradations, que nous avons encore un témoignage de ce passé héroïque.
The factory was intended to have a large turnover. At full capacity, it could process 6 wells at once. The Norwegians brought precise labour organisation to the other side of the world, and production targets even harsher than those practiced in their home factories.
They spent all day, every day in the factory, except Sunday. They were Lutheran and respected the Sabbath, but otherwise the factory was fully staffed every day. Even then, I'm not sure they didn't continue to feed the boilers on Sunday to keep the steam up. I'm almost certain of it, in fact.
Nothing was overlooked to ensure the smooth running of every technical and human element in the factory. Equipment and buildings brought from Norway had been specially designed to resist Kerguelen's harsh climate.
These men were working incredibly hard, but the picture we get from studying their living quarters is that they managed to recreate a pleasant lifestyle. Apparently, they succeeded in organizing themselves to be able to live like human beings.
The second Bossier project was 100% French, sheep breeding. The brothers studied rearing techniques in countries they imagined comparable to Kerguelen, the Falkland Islands and southern Argentina.
At the time, not many people would have taken the risk to ride off into Patagonia and live with the Indians for 3 years, saying, I'm going to live in the cold and ice to study the reality of breeding sheep, and then come back and reproduce the same thing on French territory.
In Port Couvre Bay, far from the Norwegian factory, the Bossier's model farm was established on the island's greenest part. It was to have been the first of many farms, which would eventually cover the island. The shepherds recruited by René Bossier lived here for 10 years, and like this one, left their mark indelibly.
Pierre Petit was my father. He left for Kerguelen in 1927. He was a policeman in Le Havre, and one day, doing his rounds down by the port, he was told by a ship's captain that they were looking for volunteers to go to Kerguelen and wave the flag down there, seeing as there was nobody down there, and the British wanted to take the islands. And so my father asked to see the person in charge of it all, from the Bossier company. He went to see him, and after they had made all the arrangements, off he went. There were 3 of them, 2 of his policeman friends, and their wives, and 2 daughters. They were sent to look after the flocks, to prove that you could rear sheep and pigs down there. That's what took them there.
In their huts, built with odd ends of wood, a few pieces of furniture brought from Le Havre were a reminder of a traditional Normandy farmhouse, but like this imitation fireplace, could not conceal the reality of their new lives.
He kept a diary of his time down there. In it, he talks about the weather, going hunting, the hunters, their problems, the cold, the wind, the snow, of course. There's a photo which shows the misery of it all. I don't know if you can picture it. I don't know how they stuck it down there. It must have been grim.
After the summer months, there was no pasture for the sheep on the slopes. The pigs, on the other hand, thrived on an extravagant diet of nothing but meat.
The pigs ate seal meat, of course, but the sheep needed fodder. And when no fodder arrived, they had no hope of making a go of it.
In his diary, Petit appealed to his boss.
With fodder, what profits, what wool we could deliver. Now it's for you to decide, but it hurts me to the quick to see all my poor sheep dying. In your letter you say that they should live wild. I say they can't here. That's all there is to it. He often wrote to Mr. Boissier, telling him things weren't going well, but Mr. Boissier didn't believe him. According to his diary, Mr. Boissier didn't pay his letters much attention. Wanted to have livestock down there at any cost, but he refused to send any fodder.
Pierre Petit sent his letters by any passing ship, but his pleas fell on deaf ears.
At the time, it took René Boissier almost 3 months to get down there, with a stop in South Africa, Durban for example. The ships were coal-powered. It was a full-scale expedition to the other side of the world, and by the time you got back, something else had happened you didn't know about. It took weeks to receive any information because there wasn't a telex, there wasn't a fax or a telephone. Today you know what's happening in 30 seconds, and you can send somebody off, but then...
And the Boissier had other problems. One of their ships, which came to pick up wool and seal oil, sank in Port Couvre Bay with 50 sailors on board.
My father took them in and fed them. They didn't have much food as it was, and they were often reduced to eating seal.
Within a few months, the shepherds had killed all the sea elephants in the bay. To feed their families and pigs, they began to go further afield in search of their prey. On one such expedition, one of them, Le Galoudec, was killed.
The three of them had gone hunting together, but they were caught in a snowstorm. They got totally lost and started going around in circles. My father said he'd go off ahead to find their camp and bring back food and dry clothes. So my father made it back home, and when he set off again, he saw Ménager coming towards him. He said, "Is Le Galoudec with you?" The other man said, "No, I thought he was with you." And so they lost him, each thinking he was with the other. And they found him 3 or 4 days after. He was dead. He'd been eaten by the birds, his eyes pecked out by the birds.
This grave was the first of many. The death of other shepherds through malnutrition marked the end of the Boissier project. The men, known as the governors of Kerguelen, were powerless to do anything about the developing tragedy. The banks had stopped their credit.
To begin with, everything had seemed well organised. We've got documents showing all they took with them, everything they might possibly need. It was well planned, you see. It just went sour when they got down there. I think it was all a bit utopian. The scheme just couldn't succeed. Not unless they pumped even more money into it. But it would have been a bottomless pit. As I've just said, I now realise it was a dream. Given the distance, how could you hope to develop an island lost in the middle of the ocean? Might as well have been on the moon. 13,000 kilometres by sea from France, from the mother country. It couldn't work, if you ask me. Just couldn't work.
In 1930, the survivors of the Boissier's failed enterprise were taken off Kerguelen by the brothers' last remaining ship. Even the model factory of Port Jeanne d'Arc, abandoned by the Norwegians, had become a ghost factory. Desolation Island had overwhelmed its superb boilers and the dream of industrial conquest. The Boissier brothers paid the price for their overweening ambition. The news of dozens of deaths on Kerguelen and St. Paul, caused by their lack of foresight, provoked a major scandal in France. The two brothers lived out their lives in bitterness and nostalgia. And yet they asked that their graves in Normandy be scattered with earth from the southern islands, and a legend began to grow around their collapsed dream.
Of course, people like adventurers. Those who don't succeed are ignored somewhat. That's what happened to them. Adventurers who succeed, Paul-Émile Victor for example, are the ones people admire, though he only ever put himself at risk. People always admire those who reach their aim. The Bossière boys had the financial means to be adventurers, because you need money, don't forget. But they put all their money into their adventures, and that's truly magnificent. Even if it means losing everything, it's magnificent if it's for an ideal. That's how I look at it.
No lessons were learned from the Bossière's glorious patriotic failure, and France persisted in trying to colonize her southern territories.
Le drapeau tricolore est solennellement hissé. Et cette simple cérémonie souligne mieux que tout autre la force des liens qui unit la France aux parties les plus éloignées de son empire.
After the Second World War, the government decided on military control to reinforce Kerguelen's strategic importance in the Cold War. The Gallieni brought a colonial administrator, Pierre Sicot, to Port-au-Français. His mission was to establish a powerful presence. With him came a young Farbrand, a representative of France's military and industrial power.
The French government of the time sent a mission led by Sicot to reoccupy Kerguelen and reaffirm French presence on St. Paul, Amsterdam and Crozet. Sicot finally managed to persuade us, I should say, because there was also my father, to set up an industrial complex on Kerguelen. That was the start of our involvement.
Marc Pichenard's father was a respected figure in the Paris abattoir business. His speciality was the processing of meat byproducts. His son was to exploit the family's experience and equipment and implant their business halfway around the world.
Basically, it was the realization of a family dream. My father had read about the Bossière's adventures in the 1930s, and at the time he had thought they had not gone about it in the right way. He wanted to try another approach. I had just left the army in 1949, the 11th Parachute Regiment. So for me, the whole operation was a sort of adventure, and a military project also, French presence on Kerguelen and all that. Everything came together to make a whole, if you like. It wasn't just a question of business or profitability, it was a mission of sorts, you see.
Once again, the main targets of this mission were the sea elephants.
The tracked vehicles we used were designed to be crewed by one or maybe two men. Once they had localized a fat male, which was easy at the time because they were all over the place, but preferably isolated so that they didn't have to go into a herd. The operator then fired a shot into the brain of the animal, killing it instantly. He then loaded it onto the trailer at the back of the vehicle with a pulley. We had decided to build an experimental factory to show that it was feasible to process the whole sea elephant and not just the blubber, as the British were doing in South Georgia. The challenge was to prove its feasibility, but we never did, because we closed it down. I mean, I decided to close it down after 2 years.
After a century and a half of massacre, the sea elephants were at last left in peace. The government's withdrawal from the project brought an end to industrialization on the islands. So, no airport and no factories. From the 1960s, the Southern Territories became a vast natural laboratory, devoted to research into animal life and the environment. Here, no one remembers the last sealers, but in the tiny chapel, a plaque recalls that Martine Pechenard was Kerguelen's first bride.
Ça reste le début de ma vie.
That will always be the beginning of my life as a married woman. It's quite a long time ago now, and it's a fairly marvelous memory. It's fairly unique also, because it wasn't just your local church. And now and again we look back at our photos, and all those wonderful times come flooding back.
You know, it wasn't a bad place for a honeymoon, because once you were there, you could devote yourself to your new spouse. There was nothing else to do after all. But we didn't get bored at all. On the contrary. To begin with, we were kept very busy, and we were very happy.
I watched the Gallieni leave and thought, well, she'll be back in 6 months. But I can't remember being at all concerned. You know, we were very young at the time. We didn't think for a moment that anything would happen to us, a medical problem or such like. We didn't even think about it. When the boat came back, I was pleased, but no more than that. I would gladly have stayed a few months more.
That's what adventures and adventurers in the good sense of the term are all about. Being adventurous, you might say. If you always weighed up the pros and cons, you would never do anything.
The adventure has continued since Marc Pechenard's departure, but it has taken a new direction. In the early 1960s, the small base at Port-au-Français grew to house a few dozen scientists, often young men, volunteers doing the national service, who came for a year to hibernate, as they called it. Their living conditions were considerably different from those of John Nunn or Pierre Petit. And yet they too had the impression of being the first men to set foot on virgin soil.
The Kerguelen Islands represent a universe slightly out of step with the world, or with the planet. And from a certain point of view, it's even more disorientating than the Antarctic, for example. These great dark valleys with the moaning, blustery wind, sometimes blowing the waterfalls back upwards, the lakes which vaporize, and then that feeling of being lost at the end of the world. Off the end of the world, almost.
George Pullion comes here almost every year for his research on global warming. His first visit was 34 years ago.
Generally, we would go off without radios, so there was practically no one who could have come to our aid. Nobody knew where we were, and in any case, there weren't any maps. There was absolutely no possibility of being rescued, and if we'd had an accident, maybe we would have been found 6 months or a year later, maybe.
In 1974, George Pullion, with a group of French mountaineers, climbed Mount Ross, 1,865 meters high, Kerguelen's supposedly unattainable summit.
The fantastic thing was that a large part of the island's interior was still terra incognita. There were still valleys, lakes and glaciers, which no human being had ever seen. It was probably one of the last places on Earth where you could get an inkling of what it felt like to be an explorer.
Being an explorer is to have the extraordinary privilege of giving the name of your choice to places discovered and secretly appropriated forever. George Polian and his colleagues have named numerous valleys and waterfalls. But the archipelago's largest landowner, the one who baptized the most places, was the captain of the J.B. Charcot, Raymond Rallier du Bâti. Maneuvering his tiny vessel with the skill of a great sailor, he ventured into the most inaccessible places, naming them after his comrades, his fiancée, or his native Brittany: the Gulf of Morbihan, the Kerguelen Islands, St. Anne's Finger. When the First World War began, du Bâti left Kerguelen with his exploration of the island incomplete, to return and serve his country. He told the British about his adventures on Kerguelen, and a book was published. But the French have only recently discovered this intrepid and quiet man, who resolutely kept himself to himself.
There was a big difference in age between us. My father was 44 when I was born. He wasn't a talkative man. So much so that almost all I know about him is what other people have told me. More often than not. Kerguelen was an aristocrat, a taciturn character. He was a great sailor, but fairly unapproachable. He enjoyed a certain kind of solitude. He used to talk about it sometimes, but never to me. Everything I said to you, I found out after his death. He had left a trunk with all kinds of documents inside, photos, news clippings, everything. It is one of the most beautiful places you could wish to find, despite the landscape's extreme wildness. It's the sheer beauty of the black beaches, the snow-capped mountains, the green sea full of white horses. It's quite magnificent, and it leaves a memory of something unfinished, because much of it is still unexplored. Secrets. Oh yes, there was the secret of the bottle. They opened a cave, walked in and found a bottle. Inside was a parchment signed by Yves de Kerguelen, as in Kerguelen Island. They put it back in the bottle and left it where they had found it. They didn't take it with them, and in his diary he mentions it. Some people from Paris or Marseille, I can't remember which, wrote to him, asking him to draw a map of the cave so they could find the bottle. He replied that he had no objection, but he'd do it if they took him down there, so he could show them. He would have liked to have gone back, for the memories. Anyway, they replied saying it wasn't possible, and that was that. So he took his secret to the grave.
Whether Yves de Kerguelen's bottle is still hidden in this bay, nobody will ever know, and that will be just one more of the island's secrets. If so many people have felt so deeply attached to Kerguelen, despite the disappointments inflicted on them, it is because the island constantly escapes them. Even if you manage to set foot on it, even if you think you have conquered it, you never have. It guards its secrets jealously.